I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. Our guest today is Lindsay Thomas. Lindsay, you've been involved in the economic transformation of Georgia for some time. From your days in agriculture, to your 5 terms in Congress, to your role in the Atlanta Olympics, to the presidency of the State Chamber of Commerce, and to your appointment as Federal Commissioner of the Tri-State Waters Compacts. With this, and with your permission, I'd like to start at the very beginning. Patterson, Georgia.
Well, that's where I was born and raised, Bob, 1943, November the 20th. Incidentally, at that time, quail season always opened on the 20th of November. It's a different date now, but for many years of my life. So there was sort of an omen, and I came up a typical young boy in a small town. My parents, my dad was a small-time farmer, my mother later a merchant. She was a housewife for a long time and then became a merchant, and ran a general store in that small community of about 700 people. My class, I think, consisted of about 36 or 37 of us, many of us who were still around. I did the normal things. I played football, started off in the band and then quit the band to go to football. I should have stayed with the band. And participated in things like Future Farmers of America, 4-H, was in public speaking, debate, declamation, even sang in the quartet. And so had just a I would call it a typical small town South Georgia upbringing. Close to the church, close to the land, close to my family. Great deal of out-of-doors activity, which I really came up as a hunter and fisherman. That's why I'm not a golfer today. And but it was a upbringing I was proud of. And from there, left and went to the University of Georgia. Went 1 year over to Gordon Military to try to play football 1 more year. And I found out after I got over there and weighed in at about 155 or 60 that a defensive back going up against a 200-pound fullback was not an even match. And I thought that the campus life here at Georgia intrigued me much more. So I came to Georgia, got my degree, an AB degree, was on the Hill at in the English department at that time, and it was a great experience. You know, at that time when I was here, coming in 61 and leaving in 65, you almost knew all of the faces on whichever campus you were on, if you were on North Campus or South Campus, wherever. And it was really a great collegial atmosphere. Fraternity life was at its sort of pinnacle at that time, a lot of great parties, a lot of fun. And so University of Georgia was good to me. When I left Georgia, in the last year, I started dating the lady that I would marry, who is incidentally with the university today, Lindsay Thomas. And we moved to Savannah. I started off with the C&S Bank, and very shortly after that went in the brokerage business. And I've been lucky in this regard. I've had a lot of really good careers, opportunities that I've had along my career path. And I really feel blessed about it. Not just lucky, but blessed as well. But what a good experience for an old country boy growing up in the small town down there, where family and all those values were tremendously important to me. I went into the brokerage business, and it was the only job that I ever had that I did not like and could not put my heart into. And at about the time I was about to burn out, my uncle Lindsay Grace, that I was named after, and was a great mentor in my life and a tremendous influence, he and Aunt Mary both. My uncle passed away and left me Grace Acres Farm, which had been in the family since right after the Civil War. He had come there to live right after, in 1902 with his grandfather. He and his mother came to live there. And so he left me that farm, and I went back to farming in 1973. Small open Ford tractor, 4-row operation, grew tobacco, corn, farmed my first year right by myself, and then got into a bigger farming operation. And it was that experience in farming that began to fire my imagination about, or my deep concern in, not about serving in public office, but about staying involved and being concerned about the kind of policy that was coming down the pipe that was affecting people at the ground level. And it was one of the important lessons I learned, that whatever was done in D.C., Could sound like all sorts of high-level policy that needed to be done. But the thing that I always tried to determine was how was it going to affect people on the ground back home. If we were passing ag legislation, how did it affect my farmers? If we were passing energy and water provisions, whatever it was, what did it do to the people that I represented? So that was what came to me, but at that time still I had no intention until about, it was 1982, really in the fall of 1981. Some things happened. I'd gone through difficult times in my life personally and financially, and my inheritance was on the line as to whether or not I could hold on to the farm or not. And so I knew I was going to have to make a change. With that, one day I walked in, and there on the typewriter was a 5-page, yellow page, handwritten letter from my wife at the time, Melinda. And here's what it said, and basically, here's why I think you ought to run for Congress, and here's why I think you can be elected. And now here I am, a guy that's never run for anything except, didn't even run for it. They asked me to serve on the local ASCS committee, and I was elected to that by a small group of farmers in the county. It's the only office I'd ever held in an elected position. And at first, it seemed like something to just discard, but we were working very hard to make things work. And so I sat down and read it carefully, and we had a conversation about it. And here's what she pointed out. She had worked for Bo Calloway in Washington right out of college before we were married, and was really the person with political experience and loved politics. Mm-hmm. And I was sort of apolitical, really, at that time. So what happened was our county of Wayne County, where I was then living in Wayne County, having been born and raised in Patterson, and my uncle leaving me in the farm in Scriven, just 10 miles down the road over in Wayne County, had been for the first time, was being moved into the 1st district for the first time ever. There was still a court case proceeding, and we didn't know if it was finalized, but it looked as if that was what would happen. Bo Ginn, the incumbent, one of the most popular politicians I reckon we ever saw in our state, certainly one of the most popular members of Congress, had decided to run for governor. So it left an open seat. And I knew most of the candidates. It was a time I was 38 years old. I knew I had to do something, and there was something inside of me that told me this. And this should not sound like a cocky or egotistical remark at all, because it wasn't meant that way. But I looked at it and felt something inside of me told me I could win. I could win that race. Not that I would, but that it could be won, that I could win it. And so with that, we met with a small group of friends. It expanded from there. We all talked about it, and I got into the race and was elected in November of 1982, running against 9 other candidates, and we were the leading vote getter in the primary and the runoff. There was a runoff. I was the leading vote getter there, and then we carried all 20 counties in the 1st district in the November election of that year. So I was off to Congress.
Well, without spin doctors and polls and push polls and robocalls, how did you campaign?
We did it on the streets and in the small towns and small communities, and we participated in every debate there was. We did it all. And it took a lot out of me. I still have a little stress problem in one foot today from walking the streets of those small towns. But what I found that when you went to a small town, and I had a chance to relay this to a reporter who came down to follow me when I was running against Charles Wessels for the runoff. And he said, he saw me make a speech in the back of a pickup truck down in Mount Vernon, Georgia, to 10 people in a parking lot. And when I got down out of it, I called the reporter in and I said, I want you to see this. And on the front of that bumper, there was a bumper sticker that said, Talmadge for governor. Now that's how rural the area we were in down there was. And the guy says to me, how do you intend to win an election speaking to 10 people? And I said, well, tomorrow, every one of those 10 will tell everybody else in this town that Lindsay Thomas came down here and asked for their vote. Mm-hmm. And I said, this is how it's done, and we'll just see. He said, oh, he was pretty cynical. But later on, he ate his words when we ran up on each other. I made a prediction, told him we'd win 60-40, and we'd carry every county but Chatham County. and we did. But I guess the whole thing, it was grassroots politics. My family got involved. My friends got involved. A lot of the people who had been, I guess you'd call them politicos of sorts, in the courthouse gangs and all, were already committed in the governor's race, most of them to Bo. So I had to build a new campaign, a new crowd. And I will always say this, the people that elected me, and I think this is terribly important in politics, when you think about voting for a person in high office, I think you ought to ask two questions. Who is that person going to feel really obligated to? Who elected him? Mm-hmm. And secondly, who will they bring into office to help them do the job? Because nobody does a job in no level from president on. Who will the president's cabinet be? So forth. So those were a couple of things I learned from that, and that set me off to go to Washington and do the thing that, the only thing that I knew to do, and it sort of became my watchword. I worked hard, and I was straight with people, and it worked for me.
How do you go about assembling a staff in Washington?
Well, we were lucky in that regards because when Bo lost the election, it left his administrative assistant, Bob Hurt, our chief of staff, Bob Hurt, who had been there with the 10 years for Bo, and left a lot of Bo's staff and talent in place. And we had brought on some young people that we saw who were gifted, who were politically savvy, politically interested, bright young people. And we put a staff together. I had one on the day that Bo lost. I made the call to Bob Hurt, and I was staying at Steve Green's house, who ran our Savannah campaign. He and Judy Farrell, they were friends from Leadership Georgia. And Steve said, this leaves Bob Hurt available, and he's the best you can get. It would probably have been Steve if it had not been for that, although Steve went with us through the transition period and was a special staff assistant. So with Bob's help and advice, and part of Bo's staff left there, we put together a top drawer staff, and really was greatly responsible for the successes that we had in the 10 years that I was up there.
So you go to Washington with no legislative experience. How long did it take you to learn the tricks?
I don't think you ever learn all of the tricks. You season in that position. There are guys who come there that are experienced and who understand, and they're a bit ahead. But that's not the only thing that wins it for you. I make a lot of speeches today to young leadership groups, and one of the things I point out was that when I got up there and looked at that body of 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate, and I looked around and I said, what is it that makes the successful ones successful? Because it was obvious. Some of the committee chairmen who had great sway and influence were very bright, and some were very average people. But the ones who got things done, they had one thing in common. People followed them. And those who did not have a following got very little done. And some of them were dizzily bright people who just had no cachet with the rest of the members. The ones who made things happen had a following. And I said, well, how do you do this? What makes that happen? And it simply came to me, work hard and be straight up and honest with them. And this was a time when there was still great bipartisan cooperation in the House. In fact, there was a tremendous center. If you call them Blue Dogs today or Boll Weevils, there were probably 75 or 80 members of the conservative coalition up there who worked together at that time, Democrats, and a group of Republican members who worked with us. They were moderate Republicans, unlike the tone of things today where much of that center is no longer there. But at that time it was really one of the things I was so thankful about serving in the Congress. It was a great experience to me. It was a great education. I learned everything I could. I went to the debates. I remember very well stepping out of the hall one day and Newt Gingrich said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to get a bite to eat. Come in here." And we stepped in a small anteroom, and my gosh, there was Edward Teller and Carl Sagan with about 10 members. That was all that was in this little room, about like this, debating the theory of nuclear winter. One day, Jim Slattery pulled me off the Capitol steps, said, "Get in the car and go with me just a minute." Didn't even know where he was going. We go down to the place next to Bull Feathers, and here is D. Boone Pickens and Robert Reich down there debating the restructuring of corporate America. So these were the kind of opportunities that were there that you could easily take advantage of if you didn't come there feeling like you knew it all to start with and you wanted to learn. And I learned from other members. I heard a great eulogy done recently to Ed Jenkins' funeral by Ronnie Flippo. And Ronnie Flippo pointed out that there was very few of us that when we went to vote, we might have our minds made up, we might have all of our research done and checked and run all the traps on how we were going to vote. But one of the things that we did when we walked in that room was to look up there on that big board and see whose light was on, yay or nay. And Ronnie talked about how very few of us ever made that vote without looking at our good friend Ed Jenkins' light to see where it was. So you use those combination of things. You followed people that you respected, and you were straight up and honest with people. And it got me as a conservative Southern Democrat, usually in the top 5 in the conservative coalition of all Democrats. It got me to the Appropriations Committee. And I literally had classmates of mine who came to me and said, "How did you get that appointment? That's a leadership appointment, and you vote very conservative." And I said, "Well, the only thing I know to do is tell you that I've just been straight up and honest with people, and they know where I stand." And so it worked for me, and I think it would work for anyone
So
else.
Jenkins was sort of a mentor.
Jenkins was a mentor. What I admired about Jenkins, he was very bright, but totally unassuming and unpretentious. When Ed Jenkins went to the floor, which was seldom, everybody listened. He made such great practical common sense. And Ed had friends on both sides of the aisle, and I admired that much. And it's led me today to be involved in something that's probably one of the most enjoyable things I've done in my life. I helped start in the late 80s a group called the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus. And it was those of us who cared about the future of hunting and fishing and outdoor sports, and we saw it needed a voice. Like in that day and time, there were plenty of caucuses there that represented different interests. So we formed it. Today it is the largest caucus in the United States Congress, 300 members of the House and Senate, and it's totally bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans. Dick Schultz was the first president, a Republican from Pennsylvania. I was the first vice president. And today I'm chairman of the foundation, which operates the caucus. And a very influential group of people from the industry who understand that we need a voice, and it's about conservation. This is not just about the fun or the sport of hunting and fishing. It's about preserving a great part of our American heritage, of course, for the future. But it's also about conserving the resources that sustain the fish and wildlife populations. Now, if I'd been a partisan person, I would never be chairing that board today, and it's one of the things that I really enjoy. It keeps me plugged in, keeps me involved with members, takes me up to Washington about as much as I want to go.
Well, your background in farming landed you a spot on the Agricultural Committee, which is very important to Georgia.
It is, and I started off there, and it was a real, I look at that committee today, the people who started off with me there, and it's quite a list. That list now today, there's several of those members who are in the United States Senate. Tom Harkin is there in the Senate. He was on Dick Durbin, the number 2 in the Senate, was there on the Ag Committee. There were people from both sides of the aisle who've gone on, and so many of us started in the Ag Committee. But when the time came, and it was a bit of soul searching I had to do, and when I had a shot at the appropriation, I felt that the Georgia delegation had a shot, and they decided that I would be the candidate. I thought that I could do a lot for agriculture, and I could from the Appropriations Committee. Because at those days and times when there was still money and the deficit crisis was not as serious as it is today, it should have been dealt with then. We could have dealt with it much easier. But we didn't. But it was not the make or break issue that it is in the country today. We were still looking for places that we could invest and spend wisely. And so I had a chance to do a lot for our farmers. In fact, I will tell you, And this is a matter of history. The two things I remember distinctly. Once I was on the approach committee, I was able to go to Jamie Whitten and encourage, through the support of the Cotton Council, to get Jamie to put funding. He was chairman of appropriations, to give us funding to finish the boll weevil eradication program. And it was the first time that he had ever had consented to giving money to cotton research. He just didn't believe in it, but we did it, and we got the boll weevil eradicated. We also, on that committee, I went to talk to Chairman Delagarza from appropriations, and I said, we're trying to get a market in order for the Vidalia onion, and Senator Fowler's been able to put it in the Senate side, and they're looking for me because almost at that time, about 95% of the onions grown were grown in the 1st District, my congressional district in Georgia. And we were trying to get a market in order which would refine it pretty much to that area. And Delagarza was totally opposed to it. And my comments to him were exactly this. I said, Mr. Chairman, when I left the Ag Committee, my farmers, some of them, really were skeptical about what I'd done, because that's where we built our support. And I went down and talked with them and made speeches to them and told them that I could still be just as effective, in fact, in some instances, maybe more effective, by being on the Appropriations Committee, a leadership committee, to help our farmers. And I said, if I'm not able to keep that provision in the House bill when it comes here, I very well could be defeated. Now, I don't know if it was that serious, but Delagarza listened to me. And when the time came, he allowed that provision to remain in the Ag bill that year. And that's why we have a Vidalia market in order today. Senator Fowler put it in the Senate, and I sustained it in the House. Of course, the whole delegation supported. So, yes, the Ag Committee was where I started, and I was proud to begin there. It was a great committee to serve on. But my 1st district of Georgia at that time, you had all of the coastal interests. You had the ports and harbors, both Brunswick and Savannah Port, with great needs there. We were building the Talmadge Bridge. We were building the Trident submarine base at the lower end of the district, and building on the very northern tip the last nuclear facility that came online in this country up at Plant Vogel. And then we had Fort Stewart Hunter Army Airfield Complex, which is, you know how the president just flew in there last week, one of the most important military installations in the country. So we had a mixture that was not just dependent upon agriculture. Agriculture was a mainstay, timber, and agriculture to the economy, but there was much more. And I felt like I could serve the whole district, the entire district, including my agricultural interest, just as well from the Appropriations Committee.
You mentioned caucuses. Were you a blue dog?
At that time, we weren't called blue dogs. There was a conservative coalition that we were referred to, and at that time, when I went up, they were referred to as boll weevils. But there was never a formal caucus of that other than the conservative coalition, which I served in. But we were recognized. That group it was not until after I left at the Blue Dog Caucus. And incidentally, Mike Ross, who works with us on the Congressional Sportsman's Foundation, he's Democratic chair in the House of the caucus.
From Arkansas.
From Arkansas, is leaving, and the Blue Dogs' ranks have been decimated down to probably only about 20 members.
But you were in the Sun Belt.
I chaired the Sun Belt Caucus and chaired the task force on wetlands for the Sun. I was actually chairman of the Sun Belt Caucus, and the Undersecretary of Army, Joe Westfall, today was my executive administrative assistant who ran and it was a powerful caucus. And they changed the rules you see on the caucuses then, and as far as members contributing and all of this kind of thing, and so many caucuses went away. The Congressional Sportsman's Caucus is one of the few that survived for over 23 years, and not only survived, but has risen way up in its influence in this country as far as the legislation that did. Everything in the world from the wolf compromise that we worked out, reinstating the wolf, but now getting some management to the states of wolf management because of the damage being done to the herd animals out west and overpopulate. The wolves have been very successfully reinstated, and they have to be controlled, just like much of our wildlife species do.
Let's talk about some other major issues that challenged you and you participated in when you were in Washington.
The first vote that I made just about, I think it might have been in the first day or two, interested me much. It was a vote to disallow the conversion of campaign monies to private use. And it grandfathered in the people who had been there before. You see, at that time, you could take, if you decided not to run, you could take your war chest, if you had a war chest, and convert it to your personal use. I voted to disallow that, and it was the first probably vote, 2 or 3 votes I made. The second vote that stuck in, and that one was important because when I retired, there was an article that came out that said Lindsay Thomas will get to convert his $450,000 war chest to his personal use, and that he will draw over $1 million in retirement from the federal government. And I let that article go till all the papers got it, and then I called the guy who had first ran it and said, "You need to hear the facts." And we had a sort of a come to Jesus session, which the truth was I'd voted to disallow myself from using the funds, could not do that. And to start with, my war chest was about $45,000, not $450,000. And then the last thing was on the retirement. I said, yeah, if I live to be 119 years old, I'll get $1 million in retirement. And you see, at that time, I paid into a retirement program. People have such a misconception about the federal retirement for members of Congress. It's totally blown out of proportion. You have to stay there 2 or 3 years to be vested. I've seen a lot of mail that comes around and says you serve 1 year and then you get your check for life, and which is absolutely baseless. And there's no portability of health care either, unless you're way up in senior years and have some arrangement that I didn't have. So the second most early vote that taught me, I guess, one of my greatest lessons, and I refer to it often, Social Security, when the actuaries came to the members of Congress in the late 70s and told them that the numbers proved that the Social Security formula had to be changed and had to be fixed. It was going to go broke in fairly short order. And everybody realized that this was true. You see what had happened. There were more people beginning to retire than were paying into Social Security, and of course it had been very popular to just keep adding on benefits, putting all kinds of COLAs and adjustments in Social Security. And of course people were in the first 2 or 3 years drawing out more than they ever put in. Well, it just wasn't going to work. And so they put together a blue ribbon commission. Alan Greenspan was on that commission. The House leadership and the Senate leadership, both sides of the aisle, got together and said, okay, this issue is too big, it's too important. We cannot, nobody's going to take the blame for doing this or take the heat for it. We'll have to all take the heat for it, but we're not going to let it be partisanized. We'll put this commission in place. They'll come back and give us the fix, and when they do, we're all committing to support it. Leadership on both sides. And so there was the findings of the commission, and there was the compromise on an issue. There was plenty of other issues to debate, just like there are today, to define you as to where you stand. But the issue of the deficit, the energy crisis, the health care debate, if we don't deal with some of these things now, that on a bipartisan fashion and in a bipartisan manner, and get the politics out of them, we're never going to do the things that it will take to fix them. And so it taught me what can happen when you do have nonpartisan cooperation or bipartisan cooperation within the parties, can take on the toughest and most difficult issues and deal with them as they should be dealt with in the best interest of American people, not one party or the other.
So after 5 terms, you hung it up.
I did, and just like if you ask me how I won the race or why I ran to start with, you know, hindsight's 20/20. It always is. I can go back and tell you now and see exactly how we won it. I can tell you now more clearly why I ran the first time around. And in the case of my decision to leave, it's sort of the same way. There was no one reason. There was a combination of reasons. One thing was the growing partisan divide in which I was uncomfortable. The other thing was unquestionably have to be totally honest here. And I have been all along. There's no use, this is of no value to you to come up here and me try to put any spin, because I don't tend to run for anything again, ever. The leadership of the Democratic Party was drifting so far away from, I thought, what was the conceptions here in the South, in my area of the country that I represented, that it was getting very difficult to be identified with the leadership that was just out of step with the South. And I think that is almost completely true today. It is very, very difficult for a Democrat in the South. In fact, not many of them left. So the partisanism was one of the things that I was kind of fed up with. The other thing was that it was a long, hard road. When I looked at my two subcommittee chairs, and they were great men, they were good men, they were good to me, but I knew neither one of them was about to make a move. So the idea of getting a chairmanship under me on one of the subcommittees was going to be, or a committee, was a way off. And that's when you can really make things happen. There was one other thing here that was principal to me, and that is if you stay a certain length of time, then you're tempted to stay for the career. And I was not a career politician. I was at that age, close to 50, in which I needed to make a decision. If I was not going to be there and make a career out of it, I needed to do something. And I was just not a career politician. The excitement of the Olympics came along. I had a special insight into the Olympics, and friends that were there. They had, as the appropriations member from Georgia, the Olympic Committee had sought me out, and the delegation let me be the sort of representative to the Olympics on the Georgia delegation. A former staffer of mine, who incidentally today is my wife of 17 years, Nancy Newton from Statesboro, had joined the Olympics in the late 80s. And the information came to me at about in the early, somewhere in 91, that Billy was going to be looking for a person to do government relations. And I knew Billy. He'd been in and out of my office, and Charlie Battle and I were old friends, and some of this was the original five, and Horace Sibley. And so I called him and said, what about it? And he was very surprised. But he said, I'd like to talk to you. I'm going to have somebody in the government affairs arena. And he brought me down, and we had a meeting. And he said, I want to go talk to the governor and the speaker, and I want to talk to Senator Nunn about this. Do I have your blessings? I said, sure. I would just like for you to keep it confidential in case this doesn't work out. They told him they thought I would be good at the job. And so he made me an offer, and I felt 10 years is quite a while up here. If I'd seen a fast track, or if I thought that I had some exceptional talents or abilities that would have enabled me to really do something unusual, maybe I might have thought about it different. But I saw myself as a constituent-oriented member of the Congress who wanted to serve my constituents first, my country and my constituents, and not any personal interest. And so a lot of those things, it put me back close to home. I was single, and I wanted to be closer to my kids and to my land. And I was just feeling that tug to go home. So I made no bones about it. Early in January of that year, I announced, so that there would be plenty of time for them to have a campaign, I announced I wouldn't get involved and endorse anyone, that I would stand out of the way, and felt that was the right thing to do. And I finished up my term in Washington, did not leave and cause a special election. Finished up that term and came down with the Olympics in January, right on January the 4th. You're sworn in and out on the odd year date of January the 3rd. And so on January 3rd of '83, I left Washington. January the 4th, I started at the Olympics.
As you look back over your service in Congress, what do you feel were your greatest accomplishments?
Well, there were some things that we did that were not really, during that time, one of the things that we did, we deactivated the tide gate on the Savannah River. And we went a long way towards preserving those freshwater wetlands down there. And that I did in conjunction with a group. I didn't see that as Lindsay Thomas's accomplishment. It was something we worked on as a team. We built the Talmadge Bridge. We renourished beaches. We had, my role was more of that of a team player. introduced some legislation, was parts of some minor things, worked very hard on a compromise on oil exploration on Anwar, which was never pushed. Spent 3 summers up there, and we drafted that legislation, and I think it's still what should have been done. But Walter Jones's health got bad. I was on the old Merchant Marine and Fisheries, and we had jurisdiction over the wildlife refuges like Anwar. So it didn't get to the table, but we started a debate. I also started a debate about taxation on our forest lands. I chaired the Forestry 2000 Task Force. We started it in 1985 to try to preserve capital gains for timber. We lost that. That's been reinstated now, but we lost it in the 85 tax bill, which I incidentally voted against. But I think of myself more just having maintained an office that was responsible to a myriad of the needs. We rebuilt ranges at Fort Stewart. We renourished beaches, and we down at one of the things that I felt that I could do and did do at the time was to continue the monitoring of the effects of the dredging on Cumberland Island. We had never dredged a 55-foot channel on the Georgia coast. And that had to be done to accommodate the Trident submarines. And the Navy felt all the studies had been done, but I didn't quite see it that way. We, through some negotiations that some might view, well, is that really what members of Congress do? We brought a high-tech center to Savannah for the FBI, clearing of information down there at a time in which they wanted to consolidate the field offices, and that was part of the agreement to go along with that. And I could wink on that one, but let me just tell you, we played a major role. And also in the support of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. Brought in, at that time, one of the 3 new federal prisons built came to my home county, in which that was fairly done. The county went after that. It was not that Lindsay influenced it to go there, but we supported it and got it done. So, Bob, those are the kind of the Vidalia onion marketing order that I talked about earlier. Those kind of things, and some, I felt some favorable impact on what happened with wetlands legislation, which was a great brush fire across our state in the late 80s. It was across the nation. Mm-hmm. And I still make a leadership talk today about how personalities can blow up potential agreements. And we had an agreement close to the table, and then White House Chief of Staff John Sununu, with his abrupt and abrasive personality, blew up a meeting that could have settled one of the real thorny issues of our time. And it taught me a lesson that I talk with young people about today, about how you can have all the right minds. You can have a serious issue, and you can have somebody that is just as abrasive as he was to come onto the scene and blow the meeting totally up. I'll always give him credit for losing votes faster than President Bush at the time could regain them, and friends faster than he could make them. And he was known for that. So it taught me another lesson about personalities. When you get together to try to solve a serious issue, one of the first things in the world is to get the group to warm up and to realize we might have differences, but we got to reach a consensus if we're going to do anything. My coming in here and braying like a jackass is not going to move that process forward. Mm-hmm. So it was a great experience. I tell you, one of the last things that I felt like that I played a role in, I don't think there's any doubt about this. I was on the last Codell that went over to visit. We went to Bahrain, the port of Bahrain, and flew into Israel and went to Egypt. We sat down with Hosni Mubarak. This was on the eve of the war that took out Saddam Hussein, the second one. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The first one that pushed him back and got him out of Kuwait, the liberation of Kuwait. We went over there, we listened to all of this, and we came back. And there was no doubt as to what he had done. When Bibi Netanyahu, is now prime minister in Israel, briefed us, he was head of security over there, and the defense minister, I think was his title. And he briefed us on just what they had done in the city of in the country of Kuwait, how they had totally raped the country, invaded it, raped it, changed the street names. Just it was awful what had happened. And we went back to have the debate, and one of our very liberal members, who now serves in the United States Senate, stood up before the Democratic caucus and said, "We spent 3 days over there. I have looked at this thing closely. I believe Saddam Hussein is a man of peace." It was one of the few times that I really spoke out in a very forceful manner before the caucus, and it was filled. The room was packed because that was the debate before the war resolution. And my comment was, we visited with everyone over there. My question to Hosni Mubarak, and it was just like I'm talking to you. We were in that kind of a setting. Why you've got the whole Arab nation lined up against this man? Why do you need the United States? And his question was just as clear as a bell, just these very words. Without the United States technology, we will grind men against machine for maybe a year, maybe 2 years, and we'll kill a couple of million people. With the United States technology, it'll be over in a matter of days, if not hours. I'll never forget that. It's exactly what he said to me. And I quoted that to the crowd, but I said, what you must understand is, there are two things. The first is that there was a complete consensus in the Arab world as to what Saddam Hussein had done. That he was a brigand and a pirate, that he was not a man of peace. That's not what he was looking for. And if we left him alone in Kuwait, there would be another country would be next. And he had to be dealt with. And that no nation in the world would stand aside and see what he had done over there and turn a deaf ear. And the United States could not do that. And the second thing was, I pointed out, and I have still today, when I visit Washington, a couple of friends who remind me, and they were running for re-election that year. They were thinking about voting against the war resolution. And I told them, I said, if for no other reason for you, let me tell you, there's going to be a war. Because we stood on the docks and we saw the men headed for the fields. And I personally talked with Barry McCafferty, who we know the role he played. He was my friend at Fort Stewart and was commanding general. And I talked to him in those days when we were over there. And he said, our men are in the field. We would like to see you. We are terribly busy. I'll make it happen if you want to come. And I said, no, you don't need to be fooling up with me. You tell them, the men out there, and many of them that I'd visited with and knew from Stewart, that the country's behind them. And I told these several young members there, but I said it to the caucus. There's going to be a war and you don't want to be on record against it. So from a political reason and from a fundamental reason, it was the right thing to do. And so I felt like that I had some influence on that war resolution vote because I was on that last Codell that went over there and came back. And I mean, literally, we got it back on Wednesday night. The war resolution was debated on Thursday, and we went home on Friday, passed the House and Senate, went home, and the bombing started that next Monday. So it was terribly interesting times for me to be there and to see the things that I saw and to learn, and to be there at a time, I guess if I summed it all up, when there was still that cooperative effort with members across aisle. We met some evenings, and I cooked quail a lot of times in my apartment. I'm a pretty good cook, made homemade biscuits, and we'd have Don Young from Alaska, Republican member, and Walter Jones, and different ones would come to my house. And we socialized, and it's then when we worked out a lot of the differences. That kind of thing doesn't go on today. And it's a sad thing because they've really lost a lot, young members particularly, one of the great values of being in the United States Congress.
Any disappointments?
Well, I said when I left, my one regret was, and this is true, I wish I could have learned more and learned it faster. I'm one of these kind of people that have to sit on and think on things a while, and I do a lot by observation and watching and see what works and what doesn't work. I didn't have the quick legislative skills that some of them did. The only disappointment really that I experienced was that as I served those 10 years and watched it, I saw that division in the Democratic Party at the national level that was beginning to shove its moderate and conservative members, that center, out the door. They didn't realize the value they had to them. Now, you know, there were a couple of members that were shown on television. I think it was Barney Frank and Henry Waxman, who said prior to the last election, when they were ousted, we don't care if there are a few less of those kind of Democrats. Speaking of some conservative members who had been pointed out. Well, they got their wish. There were a lot less, and they're in the minority. So that was the biggest disappointment, was to see that kind of thing happen. The other big disappointment was to see that people like a man like Johnson Unu, in a very powerful position, was more intent on protecting his political image than getting things done and bringing people together. So the disappointment was viewing rigid partisan doctrine and partisan dictums, and the fact that we did not work closer together in a bipartisan fashion to make things happen.
Getting back to the Olympics.
Yep.
How difficult was it to put the pieces together?
Boy, what a project. It was a great experience, and we did a lot of great things. My biggest regret about the games were that they could have been even a greater influence on benefiting the entire state. I saw it almost like an economic development project, and we did a great deal. Don't misunderstand me. But the focus was the window was so short to get all of that done, to build all of those venues, to get all of the security set up to do all of these things, that we didn't really have time to stop and think, how can we involve more people? How can we spread the influence here? Great. We did the torch run, which was a fabulous experience. Mm-hmm. Bob, I heard people say to me, I heard this from a top CEO in Atlanta. I won't call his name, but this is true. He said, you know, I'd never been outside of Atlanta. I've been here 15 years, never been outside the town to visit Georgia. And I went over to Cedartown. And the place turned out, they mobbed the streets there, thousands of people. And some of the nicest folks I ever met. And what a beautiful little town. So it got a lot of people out to see each other. It united us. You know, we went within 45 minutes of all the major population areas and 45 miles. So, and they were a testament to what the United States can do. But it was difficult. You pull together, stop and think about this. To get that job done, you had to pull together the very best people you could in all those various facets and fields, in athletics, in transportation, in security, in construction, all of these, and had to have this central nerve system up there that operated the place. And so obviously you pulled together a lot of guys and gals that had pretty strong egos. They were constantly saying, we can get this done, quoting Robert Woodruff, if we just don't care who gets the credit. But we had a lot of people there who were eyeing the next place, the next venue. This was a short-term project. They wanted the feather in the cap. Now, they did great jobs, and it's not a criticism of the job they did, but it would be hard to get that kind of group together, pulling together all the time. What you had was one of the most unusual individuals that I ever met, and that's Billy Payne. Because Billy, to me, is the most incredible combination of guts and charisma and intelligence that I ever ran across in one guy. Well, I've seen people as smart and maybe some as charismatic, but to be an old football player that would knock your jock off at the same time, and it was what was needed. He is an exceptional individual. He was the guy who dreamed a dream, and he knew where to go to make it. I mean, there were a lot of people like Andy Young who were incredibly important in winning the games. But Billy fostered the idea, and he had the guts to step out there. Let me tell you, it's why a lot of people get elected to office. You got to have the guts to belly up to the bar. and say, I'm running, until you do. Oh, I remember the weeks when we went through it, and I'm not pointing to myself as somebody of great courage. I did part of what I did out of desperation. But I can tell you, until I was willing to step up there and say I'm running, my friends were all encouraged me not to run. The minute I did, they all jumped in and helped me. So Billy it was exceptional, and the games were great. They were tremendous. They've given us a trademark here in the state of Georgia, not just Atlanta, principally Atlanta, but around the state, and put us in a league of nations, of cities around and states around the world that give us very unique trademark, no question about it.
Well, there's no doubt that your work with the Olympics caught the attention of the State Chamber of Commerce, and so the board of directors asked you to become president and chief executive officer.
Well, let me correct you a little bit. When I was in Washington, the chamber used to come up, the Georgia Chamber, every year start. And they would bring this group of people. And when I first was up there, I said, well, what? I didn't know what the Georgia Chamber was. Straight off the farm and straight in office. And I went to this first meeting of the Georgia Chamber. And it was what intrigued me about them to start with. I looked around that room, and I'm a native of this state, of course, as you are. And I said, boy, this is a great group of Georgia leaders. And I was impressed with them. Now, a couple of years later, we had an individual member whose name I won't mention that made a very partisan speech. And it split the crowd up there, and so they decided not to come back. That they would do what they were going to do from home and not have that kind of event again. When it was funny that when I left Washington, Charlie Harmon left Sam Nunn's office as chief of staff to come and run the Georgia Chamber. And Bob Hurt, who was my chief of staff, as I was leaving that fall, joined Sam Nunn's chief of staff, and as his chief of staff when he was chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. And he stayed there until Sam left. I never will forget when Sam called me and said, tell me about Bob Hurt. And I said, well, I've never seen anybody that operates any better than he does. He's kept me out of trouble for 10 years and made me an effective, and helped us do an effective job over here. So he hired Bob. Well, I came down and did the Olympics, and about the time I was leaving the Olympics, Charlie announced that he was going to leave the chamber. And the minute I heard that, I picked up the phone and called Bill Dahlberg, then president and CEO of Southern Company, and said, can I come see you? And he said, yes, you can. And so I went over and I said, I'd like to put my hat in the ring. And he said, then you're my candidate. Just like that. And the reason I did it, as a follow-up to that Washington trip, I went down and made the Olympic presentation to the board of directors that year. And it's a big board. At that time it was 150, 200 people. It's 300 now. And I went down there to Sea Island to talk with them, and I looked around that room again, and by that time I was really beginning to know most everybody in Georgia, the real leaders, and beginning for the big corporations and CEOs, and a lot of the civic leaders as well. And I just was terribly impressed to see from this big state, which is what I thought we needed, a gathering place where these leaders all came together. It was for a specific reason. It was business issues, but that's good enough for me. You get good people together and good things come out of it. So after I made one other call, after I saw Dahlberg, I called my friend Arnold Tenenbaum from Savannah, president of Chatham Steel. He had been former chairman of the board of the chamber. You have an appointed member each year as chairman of the board, and you have your president and CEO that runs it. And I said, Arnold, I'd like to put my hat in the ring. And Arnold, wise Arnold as he is, said to me, very, very interesting. That's all his response was. And so the two of them met with the search committee. They called off the search committee and hired me. So they did embrace me when I went and put my hat in the ring. But I had always had my eye on it because I liked that idea of this great group of leaders that came together from around our state who had the state's business interest in mind. Not that business was my only interest, but that was one of them. We have to grow. We have to have a strong economy. The first thing goes in the tank if you don't have a strong economy is the environment. And I was very concerned about our natural resources and our environment as well. So that led to those 7 years with the chamber in which we experienced a lot of great growth. I think that Bob really I was there at a time when someone like me was sort of needed. Maybe I was a little brash, but I knew how to go and fire up a crowd from my speaking experience in the 10 years in Congress and all the way. And I learned that if you would get a group together and you had a good message, that message would resonate through the crowd and it would carry what you wanted, which was a message back to all the corners. And we began to grow it, and you had great leadership. Alan Franklin, who I still see from time to time. We do a little quail hunting every year and stay in touch. Alan Franklin was head of Southern Company at the time, and he rolled out his troops. A lot of others did the same thing. Delta and all the big groups got together, and we expanded that membership up to where it needed to be, because my point was, it's one thing if you walk in there and say, well, we represent 1,500 businesses, but when you walk in there and say we represent nearly 4,000 businesses in the state, it carries a total different ring. Mm-hmm. So the chamber was a great experience, and it set the stage for the last job I had in my career, which was AGL.
Okay, let's talk for a minute about Georgia's transformation from just another southern state into the Empire State of the South. What do you think contributed to our great emergence?
I don't think there's any doubt anywhere that Atlanta and the great leaders in Atlanta had a lot to do with it. And it brings up a subject that I'm very sensitive about. I've had people out of Atlanta who wanted to go into South Georgia and our outreach in outlying areas and say to them, Atlanta's a goose that laid the golden egg. That's not what I mean. We have our own set of problems and our own challenges in our rural areas, and they're intense. And we've got our own unique opportunities that we're going to have to capitalize on. I'm not talking about tying our state to Atlanta, but Atlanta was a big stage, a city where there were some tremendously foresightful leaders who dealt with issues that they dealt with them in a way that it could have been Birmingham, it could have been Charlotte, it could have been somewhere else, but they knew that there was going to be, with the growth coming to the Sun Belt, there was going to be an emerging state that would be different and would set the pace. And Atlanta had a lot of the resources. It lacked some, but good Lord, that had a lot to do with it. But also, there was in this state an incredible amount of leadership that spread out through the extension of our universities and our land grants college systems. I remember men like Tal Duvall and particularly J.W. Fanning, Vice President Emeritus, who was really, I'll tell you a quick story about him in a minute, but these men had such foresight, and they were really great leaders, that they were just as much a part of that is the city of Atlanta. Atlanta, if the rest of the state was falling apart, we had great agricultural leaders. Agriculture today and timber are big underpinnings from our natural resources to the economies of our outlying areas. You had foresightful people like the Jones family on the Georgia coast who did a great deal with Sea Island that brought in great attraction and growth to that area of the state, and leaders in Savannah. I would say that it wasn't just the great leaders in Atlanta, it was the great leaders that we've had around the state from very far-flung areas, some from some of the most rural communities to some of the most of our bigger tier of cities, the Savannahs and the Macons and the Columbuses and the Augustas, guys like Jim Blanchard and others. So I've had a chance to travel to a lot of other states, and I've met a lot of people. And I just don't see a state that has the kind of high-tiered, that great high-level tier of leaders that Georgia has. And as long as they stay involved, and as long as we bring on another bench of leaders that had their kind of foresight and their kind of balance. And just one last comment about that. I don't think that I've seen a state. Everybody in other states, of course, likes jobs, and they like economic development, and they like growth. But if you go back to those early days when Georgia was burned to the ground after the war, and there was a long period of time in which the state languished, And finally, that generation came along that said we're going to change things, and they took it to task and said we're going to make economic growth and development a watchword in this state, and it still permeates today. I don't know of a state anywhere in which economic growth and development is more the mother's milk of politics as it is here in Georgia. If you don't understand it, if you don't work with it, I've just done an editorial piece in the paper down home about the importance of the public-private partnership, business and government working together, and to treat existing industry in a manner so that they attract other businesses and industry in. And I think we've done a great job of that through the years. We've had a lot of natural resources with us. We've had great leaders. And I think it's that combination of leadership and that desire, that burning desire for growth and economic development that spurned much of what's happened here today.
So what we're saying is that we were able to move beyond our political, racial, economic, and cultural divisions that once plagued us in the South quicker than other states.
Sure, because there was a real desire. You know, you had the Woodruffs, you had the Hartsfields, you had these leaders here, you had, and it was everywhere. I mean, it's not just relegated. I keep mentioning Atlanta names because, again, I go back to this. That was the big stage where much of the big progress and so forth was being announced and made. But, and it's true, I hate to use this analogy, but without Atlanta, we'd be a totally different state. It brings in so much. It's like the big ship that comes in and everything else comes into the port with it. So I think you summed it up pretty well. But I also will say this, I go back, and it's one of the things that I've been involved in, have a deep passion for. We have natural resources here that many states don't have. We don't have a desert in the middle of the state. We have this state constructed around the fall line. Our water resources to the south, great deal supplies of timber and agriculture. We have our big think tank universities and so forth. But that natural resource and our water is a continuing, perplexing issue here in this state that must be dealt with if we're going to continue. We're not about to dry up and blow away, but we just will be faced with limitations if we don't manage it wisely. And we'll do damage to the natural environment because whatever we do with our water determines the health of our creatures, our diversity in fish and wildlife. That's recreation. It's the river corridors that we have today, Bob, as you know, and our marsh estuarine systems to the south. These are the last great natural places that we have, and they're pressured. So, if we can continue to bring in the kind of growth and development we want, we will have to continue to present a high quality of life, and that means a healthy natural environment. When I remember when we were down in Savannah, I was with the AGL at the time, not the chamber, and they brought in the folks that were looking at the big auto manufacturer out of Germany to come into Savannah to look at the place as a place to locate. And my comment was to make some comments about the natural environment. Well, I'd worked with the river and the tide gate and the refuges and beach renourishment and marsh estuarine systems in those 10 years, and I know the drill and I know how they work. I'm not an expert, but I know a little more than the average guy. I had to. And as I began to talk about those things and pointed out that when we held the Olympics and held the sailing on the Georgia coast, that we built platforms out there and showed them pictures of the guys swimming and frolicking in the water. Well, in most places in the world, they're afraid to even get in the water. They wear wetsuits. They see sometimes dead animals and floating in the waters around them. And here it was this pristine marsh estuarine system, and these guys began to hear all of this. They literally followed me around the next 2 days that I was with them, asking questions about the beaches and the rivers. This appeals to them. People want this. They don't have to live where you don't have it. So that balance that we've got to work for is terribly important, in my opinion, for the foreseeable future.
Let's talk for a minute about our modern governors. All of them, from Busby to now Deal, has put forth great effort in recruiting industry into Georgia from around the world. Has that program been good?
Oh yeah, I certainly think it has been, and I think we've got a model here. You know, I remember the red carpet tour and the Georgia quail hunt that we still put on. I'm still active in that, not the red carpet tour anymore, but I remember watching these people who would come here and look and listen and learn about our state. All of our governors would show up for these events. And when I remember one night when Zell was governor, that we were pulling off in the bus from the governor's mansion. And Zell walked out and got on the bus and walked down the aisle and shook hands with every one of those people on the bus. And he was sincere in what he was doing. It made a tremendous impression on these people. I don't know why anything that we compete for, it should be said, well, you're just not qualified to get this kind. I think we can accommodate any kind of economic development project anywhere in the country, here in our state, somewhere. The thing that I would like to see us do is to find a way to make this growth and development that's coming to our state a little bit more evenly dispersed in places where it can locate, where the problems of growth and overcrowding and water shortages are not as critical. I think it would be wise. I think it would be better for our economy. What happens in your rural communities, Bob, that concerns me is that as fewer and fewer job opportunities exist, more and more of your local bench of potential leaders leave to go elsewhere. So it's a push-pull thing. So we've got to be smarter and be better, but if there's some limitation, I mean, you got to look at what we've got here now. I mean, I think it's 15 or 16 Fortune 500 companies located now in Atlanta. Atlanta Gaslight, or AGL Resources, has now become a Fortune 500 company with a recent merger with Nicor, the largest natural gas distributor in America today. Pure gas now. There's combinations that are big, but not pure gas. So, and I see that everywhere. JCB is located in Savannah, competitor to Caterpillar, and a world-class with offices all over the world. And they chose to come to Savannah. You've got everything from, we've got an emerging arms manufacturer down there. Kind of success story you'd dream of hearing about, but a guy that was hanging garage doors 10 or 12 years ago and came up and invented something he wanted for one of his rifles. He's a shooter. And couldn't produce it, you couldn't find it, and so he started making it. And today he's going to be bidding on the M4 replacement, which is all of the shoulder rifles for the Army, U.S. Army. So these you've got Gulfstream down there. So it's not just Atlanta, it's all over the place. And you've got the banking services of Synovus over in Columbus, and the list goes on and on and on. That you got to stop and think about it. If you travel the state as much as I have, you got to look at the great diversity that we have here, from the mountains to the metropolitan areas to our beautiful coast to the rich farmlands. Boy, we've got it all.
Well, you mentioned water. Now let's talk about your role as commissioner of the Tri-State Waters Compact, and what's going on now that has not been going on for the last 15 years.
Well, let me tell you something. I was there for 4 years. I was the first federal commissioner. Alec Pointerbutt followed me, and I think a year and a half later, the compacts, of course, dissolved without resolution. And I guess I'd like to make just a couple of observations here about it, because we could talk all day. The first thing is, it was the most complex issue that I ever got involved in. Now, that doesn't mean much when I say that, But if you take Clay Long, who graduated #1 in his law class from Harvard University and was representing the state on the legal team, made the same comment, that sort of validated it. It's an incredibly complex issue, and you see that the thing that most people didn't realize, in most cases where there have been compacts, first you wouldn't have had a compact if it hadn't been for Speaker Gingrich. He was Speaker at the time. He wanted to bring this thing to a head. He got on the phone at all hours of days and nights. I've heard Joe Tanner tell the story. And he made the people get that legislation ready and get it set up and get it passed, to set up a compact. It gave the 3 states an incredibly rare opportunity to solve our problems if you could get, and not to have to work it through Congress. Solve it here and then take that proposal to Congress, and if it was approved by the federal commissioner, which was the commissioner's job, was to look at it, not negotiate it, because we weren't negotiators and didn't have a vote. We were there to watch, to provide input when we could, and at the end of that time, if an agreement was reached, our job was to either sign off on it, do nothing, or veto it. If you did nothing or signed off on it, it of course was then sent, it became law and went to Washington for your final approval. Well, there was one terrible mistake. There was one unfortunate situation. The allocation formula was what was the real thought. How do you divide the water? In most compacts, you start to work with an allocation formula already determined. And then your work is to say, okay, how do we deliver it? Here it was to come up with an allocation formula. The biggest mistake that was made, in my opinion, was there should have been at least a year, and I want to think more like a 2-year period, in which there was a portion of that debate set up to do nothing but determine the facts and the baseline from which to proceed. Not Georgia and Alabama arguing about what was the true numbers of agricultural usage, but to have it established as scientifically as we could through an objective process that put the facts on the table. Because when I left, we were still debating, the 4 years after I was there, we were still debating facts and whose information was right. It's like the old saying about, whose facts are we going to use here? Well, there needed to be one set of facts. But in the end, I will tell you this. What you had to do, and what was, to me, almost made it a bridge too far. Each of the governors involved had to go back to his state and say, I got us a good deal, and be able to point out why it was a good deal. And that was very difficult. The only approach that I thought would have worked would have been started in this manner. These rivers are treasures. Our job is to see that we can utilize them as much as we can, but that we preserve them for future generations and build your approach around that. And to say, there's no way, guys, when you look at the vicissitudes of weather, the whole thing is around rainfall and whether we're going to get the water or not. That's what fills the rivers and fills the reservoirs. We don't control that. We can't even predict it, much less control it. So what we need, we cannot, out of that kind of environment, we can't get a 30 or 50-year agreement. It just ain't possible. Why don't we get a 10-year agreement and fix it so that we have to come back, that we make a start, and we come back and we adjust things as we gather the information based on what we're doing and how it works. Let's then come back and sit down and make adjustments. Adaptive management was what it was called. But nobody wanted that. I felt that our state was a bit adamant in wanting nothing short of a 50-year agreement. And I think it was all about being able to go out there and say, we've got all the water we need for 50 years. And not in any way raise the specter of there might be water problems here. Now, where it is today, the Magnuson ruling looks like it has given Georgia an upper hand. I think there's still a great deal to be determined and whether that's true or not. But to me, the real issue is not any court order. I've said this all along. I always thought, and I believed it, and I don't think my theory has been totally shot, that the worst negotiated settlement we could have reached would have been better than the best legal settlement. Now, I still believe that. I don't think the Magnuson thing is over. And the reason I don't is principally all of this stuff is still there. All of these federal interests are still there. And they haven't been solved as to how do you do that and still provide all the water that metropolitan Atlanta needs. Can't be done, in my opinion. And you'll have to just totally shut down some of the interest and manage the reservoir differently. And the reason for that is that we're still, the whole issue here is how much rain we're going to get. We don't make water, don't create a bit of it. That's a small watershed that fills a monstrous reservoir up there. And it takes a lot of rain in that small watershed to keep it up. And there's no assurance that that is going to continue to be. When you got plenty of water, there isn't an issue here. It's when you don't have plenty of water. And I just don't see us having plenty of water so that issue is going to go away. All of the things that brought the initial strife between us, they're all still there. They hadn't gone away. And that court ruling hadn't settled them. It might have settled our concern that we can get some more water for a while, but it hadn't fixed the problem in the long run.
Can it be solved?
It can be, but it is going to mean it's going to mean a lot of things. It is going to mean our water management has to be wiser and smarter, and our utilization has to be more controlled and planned. And maybe we can get to a level that we can then give enough assurance to the other states that there's going to be adequate water, not all the water they might want, but adequate water to take care of the needs that we all have to share in. I think it's possible, but it has to be approached differently. And I still maintain there's no way you're going to get a 40 or 50-year agreement out of this thing, and we might as well forget that to start with. We go down there and try to find, okay, guys, look, let's quit the fight. Let's try to find a way to enter into an agreement here that we can see how, as we move forward, how it works. And let's make adjustments and let's agree to come back and do it so that we keep our rivers and we don't destroy them, and that we provide as much of the needs as we can for everybody. I think that's the best of the agreement you can get. I don't think you can get it any other way. And I don't think that there's an answer like reservoir building. Yes, we can build some reservoirs, some additional ones. We should build some reservoirs, and we can. But you can't build all the reservoirs you need to provide all the water that you want forever. It won't work. Imagine building another reservoir in a county out here somewhere, and then that county, all of a sudden, well, there's plenty of water over here in this county, let's go there. And you have another realm of a sluice of development in that area that takes up all of that water. See, a strategic plan, and we did pass a water plan. I was on the Omaha Basin Commission, and I think there's a lot of good things in there that will do a lot for our water needs in the years to come. But this thing is extremely complex. It's frightening to a lot of concerns that we have. We don't want to go out and scare people that we can't provide the water we need. But somewhere there has got to be finally some realization of what the facts are. How much water could we, if we get 45 or 50 inches of rainfall a year? How much water of that are we going to be able to utilize it? You see, because not only does the water not always come in that amount, it comes irregularly. And it's like you don't build a natural gas system to provide all the gas you need all the time. If you did, it would be terribly expensive. If you built a reservoir system that did nothing but provide all the water you need forever, I don't know what the cost would be, not only in money, but in damage to the environment. You'd be stopping every stream in the state here with no water flows going down. So we'll get some help from the reservoirs. Hopefully, there might even be a chance for some kind of a compromise with Tennessee over water that might be shared with us. I don't know this. I don't think we're going to claim the river up there and get that. I just think it's a long, hard road that's ahead of us here.
Lindsay, we've enjoyed talking with you.
Well, I did too, Bob. Thank you for spending the time.
Well, you've been a great American.
Well, listen, I've been a lucky one, and I've enjoyed every minute of it, and I've tried to learn all I can, and I've always had a passion about what I do. So thank you for letting me come up and share my thoughts.
It's our pleasure.